there is a strange paradox at the heart of modern life. The people who are praised the most often seem to be those who obey the most. In workplaces, in schools, in governments, and even in families, the model citizen is rarely the bold visionary or the stubborn questioner. Instead, it is the one who follows instructions smoothly, who adapts without protest, who blends into the system without disrupting its rhythm. Obedience, once considered the hallmark of servitude, has become a survival strategy, perhaps even the safest and most rewarded path a person can take. But there is something deeply unsettling about this, because history shows us, again and again, that the same obedience which keeps us safe and accepted can also lead to unthinkable atrocities. Hannah Arendt, the philosopher who studied the psychology of totalitarianism, warned us that the most terrifying acts of evil are not committed by fanatics or sadists, but by ordinary people who simply obey orders, who suspend their own judgment in favor of the rules. This was her chilling conclusion during the Eichmann trial, where she coined the phrase the banality of evil. And yet, in our world today, obedience has become not only common, but celebrated. We reward compliance with promotions, with social approval, with the comfort of belonging, and so the moral tension sharpens. Is obedience the ultimate foolproof strategy for surviving a chaotic world? Or is it the surest way to lose one's humanity without ever noticing? This video will explore that tension. Together, we'll look at how obedience operates, not just politically, but psychologically, socially, and even spiritually. We'll draw on Hannah Arendt, yes, but also on thinkers as diverse as Nietzsche, who saw obedience as the death of creativity, and Freud, who traced our instinct to obey back to the family. We'll ask not simply whether obedience is dangerous, but whether it has quietly become the default currency of modern life. And across our journey, I'll share 6 core insights, 6 revelations that will help you see obedience in a new light. Some of them will unsettle you, others may liberate you, but together they will give you a new language for understanding why obedience has become so dominant and how you might resist being swallowed by it. So let us return to the paradox we began with. In our world, obedience appears to be the safest strategy. It wins us approval, belonging, stability. It makes life predictable. And yet, as we've journeyed through these 6 insights, a darker truth has emerged. The very obedience that protects us can also destroy us. First, we saw how obedience begins in childhood as the shortcut to belonging. It buys us love and approval, but at the price of authenticity. Second, we turn to Hannah Arendt's warning that ordinary obedience, stripped of thought, can hollow out conscience and allow evil to thrive. Third, Nietzsche reminded us that obedience kills the creative spirit, transforming us into herd animals afraid to own our individuality. Fourth, Foucault showed us that obedience is not only imposed, we crave it. We long for rules and structures to soothe our anxiety, even when they limit us. Fifth, we uncovered the quiet violence of social rewards, how praise, promotions, and approval gently chain us to conformity. And finally, we faced the hardest truth of all, that the only real alternative to blind obedience is not chaos, but responsibility, the willingness to think, to judge, to act, even when no authority stands behind us. Together, these insights form a sobering but liberating picture. Obedience may be foolproof, but only in the narrow sense of survival. It protects us from disapproval, from risk, from uncertainty. But if survival is all we seek, we forfeit something greater, the chance to live with conscience, with creativity, with responsibility. The real question is not whether we obey. Everyone obeys something. The real question is to what and to whom are we obedient? To an external authority that demands compliance, or to an inner conscience that demands responsibility, to the herd's applause, or to the quiet call of authenticity? The primal warning is clear. Thoughtlessness, the automatic reflex to obey, is what makes evil banal, ordinary, invisible. The task of being human, then, is not to erase obedience altogether, but to interrupt it with reflection, to pause and ask, does this align with what I know to be true? To pause and ask, does this align with what I know to be true? And perhaps this is the real measure of maturity, not how well we obey, but how deeply we are willing to think, not how skillfully we please, but how courageously we take responsibility for our choices. You see, the world does not quietly long for more obedient subjects. It quietly longs for people who can stand upright in their own conscience, people willing to say no when no is necessary, people willing to disobey when disobedience is the only moral act, people willing to carry the weight of responsibility in a culture that constantly tempts them to put it down. That is the kind of person the world needs, and that is the kind of person you can become, not by rejecting all rules, but by choosing consciously which ones to honor and which ones to resist. So I leave you with this challenge: the next time you feel the pull of obedience, to stay silent, to conform, to go along, pause for a moment. Ask yourself, is this choice mine, or am I merely following? And if it is not truly yours, dare to take it back, because only then does obedience lose its power, and only then does responsibility, heavy though it is, set you free. If you found resonance in this exploration, if you feel the weight and the possibility of these questions, I invite you to subscribe and to share your reflections in the comments. This channel is not a place of ready-made answers, but a shared journey, a community of people willing to think, question, and wrestle together with the timeless questions of the human spirit. And perhaps, in that shared journey, we find a truer form of belonging, not purchased through obedience, but forged in honesty, reflection, and courage. There comes a point when the conversation about obedience must turn toward its opposite, because the goal is not to live in permanent rebellion, scorning all rules and structures. That is not freedom, but chaos. The real alternative to blind obedience is something subtler, something more demanding responsibility. Kierkegaard described responsibility as a kind of fear and trembling, the burden of standing before God or before existence itself without excuses. For him, the truly authentic life was not one in which we followed rules, but one in which we recognized that no rule could ever fully absolve us of the weight of choice. To live responsibly is to live with the knowledge that every decision is ours, and ours alone. Hannah Arendt, too, placed responsibility at the center of her warning. In her report on the Eichmann trial, she emphasized that obedience to authority cannot erase accountability. Eichmann insisted he was just following orders, but Arendt's point was clear: no one can outsource conscience. Responsibility cannot be delegated, because the act of choosing, even choosing to obey, always belongs to us. This is where Jung adds another layer. For him, responsibility was not just about morality, but about integration. The more we project our shadow, our hidden desires, fears, and impulses onto authority, the less whole we become. To reclaim responsibility is to reclaim the shadow, to admit that we are capable of both good and evil, and to act consciously rather than hiding behind obedience. But what does this look like in practice? It might look like the employee who refuses to carry out a task that violates their values, even if it risks their career. It might look like the citizen who breaks an unjust law, not recklessly, but with full awareness of the consequences. It might look like the parent who tells their child not only to follow the rules, but also to ask, always, are the rules just? Responsibility, unlike obedience, is heavy. It demands thought, courage, and sometimes sacrifice. That is why obedience is so seductive. It feels lighter. To obey is to say, the choice was not mine. To be responsible is to admit, the choice was always mine. And yet the paradox is that only in bearing this weight do we become truly free. Without responsibility, freedom collapses into chaos. With responsibility, freedom becomes meaningful, the freedom not only to act, but to own the consequences of action. This is why thinkers from Socrates to Rand to Viktor Frankl all converge on a similar truth, that dignity is not found in obedience, but in responsibility. Socrates drank the hemlock rather than betray his principles. Arendt warned that thoughtlessness, the refusal to assume responsibility, is what allows evil to flourish. And Frankl, surviving the concentration camps, wrote that even when every freedom is stripped away, the final freedom remains, the freedom to choose one's attitude, one's response, one's responsibility. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a challenge. Obedience may appear to be the foolproof strategy, safe, rewarded, unquestioned, but in the long run, it corrodes conscience, creativity, and the soul itself. Responsibility, by contrast, is risky, uncomfortable, and sometimes costly, but it is the only path that preserves our humanity. The guiding question, then, is this: when you face the choice between obedience and responsibility, will you reach for the lighter burden or the heavier truth? Because ultimately, the world does not need more obedient subjects. It needs more responsible beings, people willing to think, to question, to stand, even when standing is difficult. Imagine this: a child speaks their mind in class, challenging the teacher's explanation. The room goes quiet. Some classmates roll their eyes. The teacher, annoyed, praises another student. The one who raised their hand, followed the rules, stayed polite. One child is punished with silence, the other rewarded with approval. Both have learned a lesson. Society smiles upon obedience. We often think of obedience as enforced through fear, but more often it is enforced through rewards, approval, recognition, promotions, invitations. These are the invisible currencies that keep us in line. And the withdrawal of these rewards, isolation, ridicule, exclusion, is often more painful than any formal punishment. Jean-Jacques Rousseau saw this dynamic clearly. He argued that society transforms individuals into actors on a stage, constantly seeking applause from others. Instead of living according to our inner compass, we obey the scripts handed down to us because applause feels intoxicating and silence feels unbearable. Think of your workplace. who gets promoted. Usually not the most imaginative or courageous, but the one who fits the culture, who obeys the unspoken norms, who never rocks the boat. Think of your social circle. Who gets invited, praised, celebrated? More often than not, it is the one who plays by the rules of the group, not the one who dares to question them. Even in families, children often notice that compliance earns affection more readily than resistance. This is the quiet violence of social rewards. It is not the lash of a whip or the threat of prison, but something subtler, the constant shaping of behavior through tiny doses of approval and disapproval. It is a system so pervasive, we rarely notice it operating. The psychologist B.F. Skinner demonstrated this principle in behavioral experiments. Animals and later humans could be conditioned to repeat behaviors simply through reinforcement. A pellet of food, a word of praise, a small token of reward. We are not so different. Society conditions us not with pellets, but with status, recognition, and belonging. And over time, we internalize these rewards so deeply that we police ourselves, often without realizing it. But here is the danger. Social rewards can disguise obedience as virtue. The obedient worker is praised as dedicated. The obedient student is called disciplined. The obedient citizen is honored as loyal. And yet, beneath these flattering labels, what is often rewarded is not courage or creativity, but conformity. This becomes particularly insidious when the structures themselves are unjust. A corrupt company may reward the employee who stays silent. An authoritarian state may celebrate the citizen who denounces their neighbors. A toxic group may admire the member who suppresses their doubts. In each case, the rewards are real, but they purchase obedience at the expense of conscience. And so we face a dilemma. To reject obedience is often to lose not only approval, but also status, connection, even livelihood. The social cost of disobedience can feel unbearable, and yet, to accept the rewards of obedience blindly is to risk complicity in harm. Perhaps this is why true independence is so rare. It requires a willingness to live without applause, to endure disapproval, to stand in the silence of exclusion. It requires finding one's worth not in the eyes of others, but in the fidelity to one's own conscience. This is the quiet revolution, to see the violence hidden in rewards, and to decide, consciously, when the price of acceptance is too high. So the guiding question becomes, what rewards are shaping you? Whose approval are you unconsciously obeying? And is the belonging you gain worth the authenticity you sacrifice? Freedom sounds intoxicating in theory. The ability to live without restriction, to make our own choices, to follow no one's orders but our own. And yet, when people are truly given freedom, what often emerges first is not joy, but anxiety. Think of the student who graduates and suddenly faces a blank future. No more syllabi, no more teachers, no more grades. On the surface, this is liberation, but for many, it feels terrifying. The structure that once told them who they were and what to do has disappeared. Freedom leaves them paralyzed. Michel Foucault understood this paradox deeply. He argued that obedience is not merely imposed from above, it is something we participate in willingly. Rules and structures soothe us, they give us shape, rhythm, and identity. And so we seek them out, often unconsciously, because freedom without guidance feels unbearable. Consider how modern life reinforces this. We track our steps with fitness watches, obeying the algorithm's silent commands. We follow traffic lights, workplace policies, social etiquettes, and unspoken rules about what one can and cannot say. Even in leisure, we submit ourselves to structures, workout programs, diets, self-improvement plans, social media trends. What do all of these have in common? They relieve us of the dizzying responsibility of deciding for ourselves. Freedom is possibility, but possibility can be overwhelming. Structure shrinks the chaos into manageable lines, and when structure becomes authority, obedience follows naturally. This is why revolutions often disappoint. A society overthrows an oppressive system only to find that chaos rushes in. People then long for order again, and so a new authority rises, often as restrictive as the old one. The cycle continues because at root, we crave rules more than freedom. Foucault called attention to how modern institutions, schools, prisons, armies, hospitals, discipline us not just through force, but through subtle normalization. They don't need to demand obedience outright, because we have already internalized the desire to be orderly, efficient, measurable. We police ourselves. We obey willingly. And this insight reveals a sobering truth. Obedience is not only about survival or fear, it is also about comfort. To obey is to surrender the burden of freedom. It is to let someone else, a teacher, a boss, a government, even a cultural script, carry the weight of decision. But there is danger in this comfort, because the more we surrender responsibility to structures, the less capable we become of bearing freedom. Like a muscle that atrophies when unused, our capacity for independent judgment weakens. We begin to prefer rules even when they harm us. We cling to structures even when they limit us. We obey not because we must, but because we want to. Think of the person who stays in a stifling job because it provides clear expectations, or the partner who remains in a controlling relationship because the rules, however painful, feel safer than uncertainty, or the citizen who defends oppressive laws because at least they preserve order. These are not exceptions. They are symptoms of a universal longing for structure. And so we arrive at another paradox. Freedom may be our highest ideal, but structure is our deepest craving, and obedience becomes the bridge between the two, the way we turn chaos into order, even if it means sacrificing parts of ourselves. The guiding question here is not whether we need structure. Of course we do. The real question is whether the structures we obey are chosen consciously, or whether we submit to them blindly, simply because they promise safety. If the first path is difficult, the second is dangerous, because history shows us that those who crave structure most desperately are often the easiest to control. There's a familiar image. Nietzsche often used the herd. He looked out at society and saw not individuals thinking and living for themselves, but masses moving together, obeying unspoken codes of behavior. To him, the herd animal was not a literal cow in a field, but a metaphor for human beings who find comfort in sameness, in the safety of conformity. For Nietzsche, this was not a harmless quirk of human psychology. It was a catastrophe for the human spirit, because within each of us, he believed, there burns a creative flame, the will to power, the drive to shape our own existence, and nothing extinguishes this flame faster than blind obedience. Consider the artist who begins with a bold, authentic vision, but then the critics weigh in. The audience hesitates. The market demands a safer style. Slowly, the artist bends. Their work becomes less about self-expression and more about approval. They obey the herd's taste, and while they may earn applause, their deeper originality, their inner voice, dies in silence. Nietzsche warned that this fate is not limited to artists. It is the condition of modern humanity itself. We are taught from birth that safety lies in sameness, that deviation is dangerous, and so we obey. We obey in how we dress, in what we say, in what we desire, even in how we imagine success. The creative spirit, the possibility of becoming something uniquely ourselves, withers. Why do we obey in this way? Nietzsche thought it was fear. Fear of standing alone, fear of ridicule, fear of failure. The herd offers protection. If everyone believes the same, then no one must face the terror of solitude. But protection comes at the cost of transformation. We remain what we are, instead of becoming what we might be. And yet, Nietzsche was not hopeless. He pointed to what he called the Übermensch, not a superhuman in the comic book sense, but a person who transcends the herd, who dares to create new values instead of obeying old ones. This figure resists obedience not for rebellion's sake, but for the sake of becoming fully alive. You might notice how radical this sounds in our own lives. Imagine choosing a career not because it is respectable, but because it expresses your deepest calling. Imagine holding a belief not because it is popular, but because it is true to your experience. Imagine creating a life not through obedience to external scripts, but through fidelity to your inner necessity. That is the Nietzschean challenge. But the truth is, most of us feel the pull of both forces, the safety of the herd and the call of the spirit. And so the practical question emerges, which do we nourish more? The more we choose obedience, the more our spirit atrophies. The more we dare to disobey, thoughtfully, creatively, the more our true individuality unfolds. Nietzsche once wrote, "The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. If you try it, you will often be lonely and sometimes frightened, but no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself." Perhaps that is the most dangerous, and yet the most liberating truth about obedience. It may protect you from external harm, but it quietly robs you of the one thing that makes life worth living, the chance to become fully yourself. So let me pause here and ask if reflections like these resonate with you. If you find yourself questioning the hidden rules of modern life, the subtle ways we are shaped by society, consider subscribing. Each week we explore these questions together, not to provide final answers, but to carve out a space for thought, for reflection, for courage. And as we move forward, the path grows more unsettling, because if Nietzsche showed us how obedience kills the creative spirit, Michel Foucault will show us something even more disquieting, that obedience is not simply imposed on us. We crave it, we seek it, and that hunger may be more dangerous than any authority. In 1961, the world turned its eyes to Jerusalem, where a man named Adolf Eichmann sat in a glass booth on trial for crimes against humanity. He was no fiery demagogue, no monstrous figure of hatred. Instead, he appeared ordinary, a bureaucrat with a tidy suit, a nervous demeanor, and a habit of describing his actions in dull administrative terms. He insisted he was just following orders. It was here that Hannah Arendt, covering the trial, made her most unsettling observation. The greatest evils in history are not carried out by sadists or fanatics, but by ordinary individuals who suspend their judgment, who replace their conscience with obedience. She called this phenomenon the banality of evil. This phrase has often been misunderstood. Cased Bohm, Arendt did not mean that evil is trivial. She meant that evil, when filtered through bureaucracy and obedience, becomes terrifyingly normal. Eichmann never saw himself as cruel. He saw himself as efficient. In his mind, he had obeyed the law, fulfilled his duty, followed the chain of command. His obedience had annihilated his moral compass. Why does this matter to us today? Because the psychology that allowed Eichmann to commit atrocities is not confined to dictatorships or wartime. It is a potential within all of us. Psychologist Stanley Milgram tested this in the 1960s, asking ordinary volunteers to administer what they believed were painful electric shocks to strangers, simply because an authority figure in a lab coat told them to. Most complied, many to the point of delivering what they thought were lethal shocks. Again, these were not sadists, they were ordinary people. What Arendt and Milgram both revealed is that obedience can hollow out the conscience. It allows individuals to outsource responsibility to an external authority, the state, the boss, the teacher, the group, and once responsibility is outsourced, morality evaporates. We no longer ask, is this right? But only, am I following the rules? Think of how this plays out in modern life. An employee sees unethical practices in their company, but says nothing, because that's above my pay grade. A citizen witnesses injustice in their society, but shrugs. That's just the law. A soldier carries out an order without question, even when it violates their own moral intuition. In each case, conscience is silenced by obedience. This is why Arendt's warning remains so urgent. Obedience, left unexamined, creates a vacuum where evil can thrive, not because people consciously choose cruelty, but because they abandon the act of choosing altogether. And in a society that rewards compliance, this abandonment becomes not only easy, but respectable. But here lies the deeper paradox. Obedience feels moral. To obey authority often feels like the right thing to do. We are trained from childhood to equate obedience with goodness, with discipline, with virtue. Disobedience, on the other hand, feels reckless, selfish, even sinful. This inversion makes it dangerously difficult to notice when obedience itself becomes immoral. So what do we do with this? The answer is not to reject all authority. That would be chaos. Rather, it is to reclaim responsibility, to remember that no authority can absolve us of conscience, that obedience does not erase accountability, even if society pretends it does. Arendt's final warning, then, was not about the past, but about the ever-present risk of thoughtlessness. She reminds us that the true safeguard of morality is not blind obedience, but active judgment, the courage to think, even when thinking sets us against the current. And so the guiding question becomes, when you obey, whose voice is speaking through you, the voice of your own conscience, or the borrowed authority of another? Picture a young child at the dinner table. The child fidgets, wants to speak freely, but each time they interrupt, the parent corrects them. Sit still. Wait your turn. Do as you're told. Do as you're told. At first, the child resists, But soon they notice something. When they obey, the parent smiles with approval. When they disobey, the parent withdraws affection, scolds, or punishes. Over time, the lesson crystallizes. Obedience is the price of belonging. This pattern is so ordinary, so natural, that we rarely pause to question it. Yet psychologists like Freud argued that our very first experience of authority is parental, and that the family becomes the template through which we interpret all future authority. In Freud's superego, we internalize the voice of our parents, carrying their expectations inside us long after we've grown. Obedience, then, is not just about following rules. It is about securing love, protection, and the assurance that we are not alone. Think of how this plays out later in life. At school, the obedient child is called a good student. Teachers smile at them, peers respect them, doors open for them. At work, the employee who follows orders without resistance is deemed reliable, trustworthy, and professional. Promotions go not necessarily to the most imaginative or courageous, but to the most compliant. In friendships and relationships, too, we often learn to soften our edges, to obey unspoken rules of politeness or conformity, because to disobey is to risk rejection. In each case, obedience functions as a disguised shortcut rather than negotiating our individuality with every new group. We simply yield to the script. We bend to expectations, and in return we receive belonging. And belonging, as modern psychology reminds us, is one of our deepest human needs, as essential as food, water, or shelter. But here lies the paradox. The belonging purchased through obedience is always conditional. It is contingent upon continued compliance. The moment you resist, the approval vanishes. The child becomes difficult. The student becomes disruptive. The employee becomes insubordinate. The friend becomes selfish. And so we learn to equate disobedience with exile, a terrifying prospect for social beings who depend on connection for survival. The philosopher Erich Fromm once wrote about this tension in Escape from Freedom. He argued that many people prefer obedience because freedom in its raw form feels unbearable. Freedom means standing alone, shouldering responsibility, risking alienation. Obedience, on the other hand, provides the warm illusion of safety. To obey is to belong, and to belong is to feel real. But if obedience is only a shortcut, what gets lost along the way? What does it cost us when we trade authenticity for acceptance? This is where the deeper danger begins to emerge, because belonging that depends on silence, on compliance, or on shrinking yourself is not true belonging at all. It is conditional membership in someone else's world, purchased at the expense of your own. Consider how many lives are quietly shaped by this exchange. The artist who abandons their vision to please the market, the lover who suppresses their truth to keep the relationship intact, the citizen who sees injustice but looks away, fearing the social penalty of speaking out. In each case, obedience is the thread that binds them to others, but also the chain that limits their becoming. And so the first revelation is this: obedience appears to be the fastest road to belonging, but it often leads us into a subtler form of exile from ourselves. The question, then, is not whether obedience helps us belong. It clearly does. The question is, what kind of belonging do we want? One purchased through conformity, or one built on the harder path of honesty, even at the risk of rejection? This is the foundation. If obedience begins as the price of love, then to free ourselves, We must learn to distinguish love from approval and belonging from conformity. Only then can we step into a more authentic way of being.